Merci à tous. Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear Vincent, for this roundtable.
Maritime.
So taking care of our maritime heritage. So this notion of usage and sharing that you mentioned will be discussed further and deepened by next speakers. So that is the topic of the next roundtable. So I'm inviting Peter Killop, Director of Ecom, and who will be moderating our roundtable. So Peter, thank you for joining us, and Peter Rogers and my friend Robert Donzal, who is with us remotely. And I'm inviting you to discover this promotion done by the explorers. So a short video done thanks to videos and still pictures done by the National Maritime Museum of France.
Yeah, I'm there. Hello, good afternoon. Bonjour. Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, thank you for staying with us for this round table highlighting the treasures of maritime heritage. And welcome with me two of our speakers on the podium. The third one will be online with us. Paddy Rogers, the director of the Royal Museums in Greenwich. Robert Domsal, who is online. For the time being, you just see his photo. And Vincent Compredon, I think I don't have to present you here. Carrying oaths to Athens, I think. And we would like to speak about, and maybe myself, Director General of the International Council of Museums, the only and the global association of museum professionals and museums with about 45,000 members in 140 countries around the world, almost as many countries as the United Nations. Representing the museum community, which is very diverse, I must say, between, of course, Asia, Africa, and Europe. And we would like to speak about how we present maritime heritage, how to communicate about it now and in the future to raise awareness for this heritage. The term was, you brought it up this morning. How to show you its value and how to inspire responsibility, and maybe we can come back to these points in the course of our dialogue. In the past 2 years, museums, societies as a whole, but museums have faced the challenges of the COVID pandemic because of the health situation and of course and the restrictions which came with it, but even more so the effects of this pandemic, which meant the loss of visitors, closures of museums, and a loss of income. As an association, we have run 3 surveys until now to know more about the situation of museums in the world. And in the first lockdown, I can tell you almost all museums around the world were closed. The situation looked quite bad. We expected 13–15% of the museums around the world to close permanently. This figure is going down now, so the situation seems to brighten up a bit, let's say, to get better. Nevertheless, there are challenges, and our surveys show these are challenges which were there before and which have been accelerated by the pandemic. Of course, the digitization of everything what we do. And of course, this had an effect, and maybe you can speak about how you include this in your presentations, because a museum is very much about the experience on a ship, if it's in a museum, or in the museum itself, and about the object. And online, this is very different from the on-site experience. Globalization is, of course, a challenge. It was mentioned before by Matthew Tanner and others. Climate change and sustainability as well. And the museums have, of course, to raise funds to continue to fund their activities if they lost income. They have to reach out to the public again, or maybe to other publics, different publics. This is something we should speak about today and show. Personally, I think they have to show their value, their value for society by making what they have, what they show accessible, inclusive, and of course sustainable, not only in the ecological but also in the social and the economic sense. You know that sustainability has these three aspects according to the general definition. And I think our speakers today can present some ideas, innovative ideas about all these aspects. And I would like to start with Paddy Rogers. To look first at globalization and sustainability. You had recently an exhibition about life at sea in your museum. Maybe to start with, you can also present your museums to give us an idea of the heritage you present, so that we get a view also of the three different museums you represent today.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you very much for having me here, Vincent. It was a real pleasure, and I hope that I can at least keep everybody awake as we get through a long afternoon, and it's always difficult, isn't it? There are three things that a museum must do. You must connect, and you must connect. Because it's really in that connection with our collections, with our audiences, and with our heritage that we can really be impactful. I want to talk to you a little bit about the museum, but before I get to the museum, I'm going to start at the beginning, as it were, because one of the parts of the museum at Greenwich includes the Royal Observatory. I'll come to why they're connected later on, but we have the Royal Observatory as part of our collection, and it includes astronomy and astrophysics as part of the area of learning. When our astronomers want to talk about the question they're asked nearly every day, which is there life in the universe? They say, well, the technique that we look for life in the universe is we look for a solar system, somewhere like ours, and we look for the habitable zone. What's the habitable zone? Well, the habitable zone is close enough to the star not to be too cold, and far away enough from the star not to be too hot. In our solar system, 3 planets are in the habitable zone. Venus, which has an atmosphere of greenhouse gases and is actually hotter than Mercury. Mars, with no magnetosphere, holding no atmosphere, is actually colder than can naturally support life. And the Goldilocks planet, I'm sure you know the story of Goldilocks, where the porridge was not too hot and not too cold. Earth is the Goldilocks planet. So this is fantastic, there's life on Earth. But much more than that. The Earth would normally have a very hot equator where life could be warm but difficult, and poles too cold to support life because the sun does not strike them with the rays evenly. They're much denser at the equator and much less dense at the poles. But Earth is lucky yet again that it has the ocean. 65% of the planet is covered by a fluid that transmits heat. And as a result of that, the habitable zone on Earth moves far outside the tropics into air. Virtually the whole planet becomes habitable because of the ocean. And the ocean distributes the heat by movement. And as the oceans move to distribute heat, they distribute animals, fish. They create weather. Eventually they were to distribute human beings. And human beings learned how to manage those currents that were created by the movement of water by building craft, initially that sailed on the currents, and then as technology advanced, they learned how to manage the currents and to work with the wind and to work with the water. And this is how human beings spread as the rest of life spread on Earth. The ocean is integral to our habitability, it's integral to our culture, it's integral to our existence, it's integral to our distribution, and of course it's integral to all of those things continuing right now, today. But we forget. We forget because we don't live very near it anymore. Today, if I asked any one of you to stand up and to start taking your clothes off one by one and telling me how they came to France or to your country where you bought them, it wouldn't be long before you were naked and 90% were in the pile that said came by sea. Shipping is still distributing 90% of the goods around the world, and how many people know that? How many people are taught that? How many people make that connection? One of the other items we have, apart from the observatory in the in our museum, in the National Maritime Museum, is the Cutty Sark. The Cutty Sark is a disaster of a ship economically. This was a piece of bad luck from a ship owner who had been very lucky all his life. Is that they keep rolling the dice, the ship owners, and eventually he built himself a wonderful clipper, which had the misfortune to be delivered at the same time as the Suez Canal was opened. But at the time that that ship was built, we had globalized trade at a very low level, with virtually no impact on the planet systemically. Yes, we were polluting, but we weren't affecting ocean or weather systems from pollution. So what happened? Well, the Suez Canal opened. I don't know who was responsible for that. But we started then to see the distribution of coal east of Suez and the real sustainability of the steamer. Steamers had been used for localized voyages, and they were more reliable than wind systems. Wind systems, of course, suffer from intermittency. Sometimes the wind blows and sometimes it doesn't. So there's always a problem with managing the wind. So as we started to use hydrocarbons, we started an era of massive globalization, reliable, cheap fuels. And the reason they were so cheap is because we did not count the destruction done through pollution to the global commons, to the things that we had and shared in common, the oceans and the atmosphere. And it's only now that we realize the impact that we're having. And as we started to have those ships going into these cheap carbon destructive trades, the ships lost beauty. They stopped being aesthetically wonderful. Why? Because nobody cared. When you work with the wind and you work with the sea, you have to build something that's almost organic, because you have to understand the water and you have to understand the system and you have to be close to it. It's why the Cutty Sark is beautiful. But anyone who's seen a 24,000 TEU container ship can tell you that's not beautiful. Why? It's the arrogance of the will. It's the arrogance of man, that bigger is better and you can punch your way through the ocean regardless of the forces, because no one is counting the cost of the fuel. And so we build these ugly systems of transport. But those ugly systems of transport, as they get bigger and they're bigger, they took the ships further and further away from humans. Now the ships no longer come into Greenwich to anchor in the river, to see the time ball drop, to tell them what time of day it is, to set their watches in order to navigate. They can't. They can't come to Tilbury. Most of them now can only go to Felixstowe or to Rotterdam. Maybe here they go to Le Havre. I mean, there are very few places. And these big ships go further and further away, and our seafarers go further and further away, and they drop from the public consciousness, and we lose our connection. And then our visitors think seafaring is something of 100 years ago. They don't know that it's a life today. And this was really the ambition that we had when we introduced an exhibition called Exposure Lives at Sea at the museum during the COVID lockdown. It was a photographic exhibition because it was easier to assemble, but we used 6 photographers who worked professionally, but at the same time were professional photographers. One of them worked on trawlers in Alaska. One of them had worked on bulk carriers and was an engineer, a Romanian engineer. One of them worked in Arctic stations. Another one was a diver, a woman who worked with biological science in California. And we created some images of the way that the ocean is and the way that people live at sea. And we used it to host a conference, not just with other museums, but with the maritime professional industry, the International Chamber of Shipping, to ask questions about these very issues. How do we bring consciousness? What's the nature of well-being in shipping for seafarers? What is it like to be isolated? What impact has COVID had on a seafarer? Many of the seafarers on these huge ships would do a 6-month working period. Can you imagine? For 6 months, you work non-stop every single day. And then COVID comes along, and you can't get off, and your relief can't get on. And you can't go on holiday, and you can't have a day off. So you have to do another term. The longest I heard of was 430 days at sea, working every day. You can imagine, suicide rates go up, people at home can no longer afford to live because they're not being paid anymore. And so we tried to bring all these things together in a conference and discuss them, and to put them in the context of what had life been like on the Cutty Sark, what had life been like on other ships. So to make the connections all the time, because it's now the past informs, the past has created our present and informs our future. And if we can keep this continuity of understanding ourselves, then trust me, the visitors are going to be very excited, and they're going to understand the importance of their heritage and of their culture.
Thank you very much for this excellent example of an exhibition about sustainability and also about globalization, because the crews on these ships, they are from the Philippines or other countries and traveling in Europe and all around the world. Very good to show these aspects of sustainability and globalization of what we do in a maritime museum. I would turn to Robert Domzal, who has joined us now on the screen, director of the Maritime Museum of Poland in Gdansk. And I would ask you as well, maybe to say a few words about their museum, and then about one aspect, very interesting projects you had to make maritime heritage accessible for disabled persons, and also to make underwater heritage accessible. Please, Robert.
I hope we can see and hear each other.
We can see you, yes, and we hear you.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be with you and to take part in the meeting and round table. I'm leading one of the biggest museums in Europe. It's the National Maritime Museum in Gdańsk. We have 10 branches, employ 250 people, and run several museum vessels. Among our branches, we have 2 big museum vessels. Steamer Soldeg, built as the first seagoing vessel after the Second World War in Gdańsk. We also have a big frigate, Dar Pomorza, which is based in Gdynia. But here on the left, you see the building of the medieval crane. This great crane is also the branch of our museum with the exhibitions telling about maritime history of Gdańsk as a harbor in Europe. I must say that all three mentioned objects are very difficult and hardly accessible for the handicapped people. We are daily struggling with the challenge how to make our objects accessible for the people with disabilities. All two vessels that you see now, and also the great crane, originally were, of course, not supposed to be the museum objects. They were active ships, seagoing vessels, and somehow accidentally it turned out that they are the museum objects now. What we developed and what we are working on is to how make them accessible for the people with disabilities, how to present the interior of the vessels for the visitors. Sometimes because of the high water, because of the weather conditions, it's pretty difficult to get on board, even for the young people, not mentioning the people with disabilities. So the photo here is presenting the very unique film. We call it interactive spheric film, which is based on the Oculus glasses, which you see on the photo. And we propose for the visitors who cannot go inside of the museum vessel to put the Oculus and to make interactive tour, not only on board of the vessel, but also beneath, to go to the loads, to go to the engine room, to go to the different places which are daily very hard to visit. So that's why I'm just trying to put our effort to make such a kind of interactive ways of visiting more and more popular. So not only in my opinion, but also in the opinion of many museums which are suffering from the pandemic time, such a kind of interactive online ways of visiting museums are pretty important for us. Another field of our activity that I would like to mention is underwater archaeology. And again, our museum is working since 50 years on the protection, documentation, and education connected to the underwater sites, mostly shipwrecks, which are lying in our Gdańsk Bay and in the Baltic Sea in general. 5 decades ago, we used different methods of documenting shipwrecks. Nowadays, we are working with the digital cameras. We are making the photogrammetric models of the vessels, which could be seen by the people who are not diving, who cannot go beneath the sea surface. In 2015, we opened a kind of virtual wreck museum where we are making available many shipwreck models, which could be zoomed, which could be seen as 3D video movies. Right now we have over 20 shipwrecks documented like this and presented in the same way, accessible for the people who usually are not going to go under the water. So such cases, I think, are presenting the demands which we are going to see probably more and more often in the whole museum world. I mean, how to work online with the audience, how to work with the audience with special demands, with the society which is getting older, unless all over Europe. So people who cannot visit, as I mentioned, the interior of the museum vessels. Because of the pandemic period, such a kind of challenges were even more visible. Our museum and many other institutions like our had to move a lot of activities into the internet sphere. I would like to mention the online education, which were pretty hard experience for us. Of course, because of thousands of hundreds of students had to spend many hours daily in the front of the computers, making or doing the daily lessons. So how to convince them to spend 1 more hour a week or some more time to sacrifice for getting in touch to the museum educators. Of course, we are not going to solve all the problems. We are just looking for the new ways of communication with the society, communication with the younger audience, with the people with some special demands. And the example that I gave, just the top of the iceberg, of course. But I would like to share with you some of the experiences that we just had. And in my opinion, we just need to develop such a kind of ways of communication. So I hope you can find time to visit our website and to see this virtual wreck museum yourself, and also to see the devices that we offer to see the museum vessels, which I mentioned. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Robert. I don't know if you heard the applause from the floor.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Please stay with us. I would pass now the word to Vincent Campenon, but I would like to have maybe a final round or ask a question to all of you in the end. But before that, I would like to ask you about the project of your museum, the refurbishment that is planned, that should open, the museum that should open next year. How do you address the audience? And we had the example of the disabled persons. I don't know if you want to take one specific example of maybe a new audience or a younger audience. Please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Merci, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Speak in French, I'm sorry.
I'm going to speak French.
Merci
Thank you very much for proposing this subject. So I'd like to start by connect. You started with connect. I'm going to start with communicate. Communicate. Why communicate or connect? Well, firstly, it's part of my experience, and also because France has developed, of course, a new kind of museum model. We found it faced with a major question. I mean, how can we transmit and convince of importance of the sea, the taste of the sea, the awareness of how important the seas are? Well, for France, it was a small revolution, as it's a national marine museum. And coming back to Matthew, which is different from France between maritime and marine, we were talking about that because in France, marine is the armies. It's the navies, of course. We've got different kind of navies. It's not the same thing. And maritime is more broadly all those kind of questions. So the challenge we had to face, and which was imposed upon us with the team here as well, was to transform a museum that is the National Naval Museum under 1848 Louis XV to make it into a museum open to the future. So how could we do this? And that's where I'm going to answer your question, Peter. How do we set about that? That is a museum which was always an amazing naval museum, National Naval Museum, and how to replace it, this museum about the history of the past, and to make it into a museum of the future. This was really the question, the problem, as a kind of dilemma. It was very complicated from that. So we were able to invent, but I'd just like to repeat what I was saying at the beginning of this afternoon, that is to have a museum about the future, which also convinces and transmits. Just let me give you some basic examples. Unfortunately, we can't go further. So it was, first of all, open up, open up. Communication is open. You understand our scientific culture on the sea, and no longer just the Navy, the National Navy. I mean, don't let's forget it, of course. It's very present, the Navy, in the museum, but we see more important questions such as ecology for French. They're very interested in ecological matters, economic, scientific, military and strategic questions as well. So we're not just talking about the Navy, but we're talking about everything and its second importance. And the second fundamental point, another form of opening, that is opening up to the public at large, because the Navy Museum had a traditional museum of kind of people who liked, you know, the Navy. Their grandfather coming along with his grandchildren and say, look, come have a look, I'm going to show you these beautiful pictures of the sea.
C'est de transmettre et convaincre pour tous les publics, à tous.
And we wanted to do this. We wanted to attract the public at large, particularly young generations. Often, after all, they are the future. We had to speak to them and address them. And when I say this, we shouldn't forget people who like them, the amateurs, people who might know one aspect of the sea. I mean, they go to the beach, or perhaps beach activities. We've got to address them too, of course. We've got to speak to the younger people. We've got to speak to families. We've got to address them. We've got to speak to those who've never heard talk of the sea as well. We have to talk to, as we say, we've got to say people as well who never go to museums at all, you know, the non-museum goers. And we wanted to have a museum for all, and that is a big change. And the second point, we were talking about transmission. Transmission, we were talking about, yes, of course, we want to transmit the awareness of the importance of all these points for the museums, but as well in terms of communication, we want also to transmit a message. We want to transmit this message, the message being the sea is the future of humanity. But this message has got to be simple, and it's got to be hammered home several times. You've got to repeat it over and over again. For us, you open up for the sea, you open up to the public at large, you transmit a message. But to do all of this, it's not all that is. It's 250 years old. You've got to have some kind of dynamic behind it, because we're in the 7th year of our transformation. In other words, we've been working on it for 6 years already. We understood that this is a museum of the past. We've been asked now to talk about the future. Well, in terms of communication, we're not just talking about before and after. We're talking about today, what's happening now. So we have created a dynamic between the past, the present, and the future. In other words, a flow which I think really feeds all the choices and discussions. I have a sentence that I really like it, which is, the past gives its depth to the present, which sheds light on the future. So this was said, it's going to be opened at the end of next year. That is on the basis of the past, open to the present and open to the future. Well, that isn't all. We've also got some museum professionals in a kind of transformation which invented museography, that is architecture. It's going to be very new in museography terms. And inertia. I believe this was mentioned at the beginning of this. Sorry, it's immersion. I'm sorry, immersion. Many pictures, a lot of pictures, very essential today. And we said we're going to be looking at more and more pictures 360 degrees pictures, and this is Casino Strook. Well,
ça tomberait très bien. Le temps qu'on fasse un teasing
well,
jusqu'à l'ouverture, une grande vague.
this is going to be a huge wave, a wave. We want the visitor to be covered, to be submerged in this wave, and we want to see the energy which you feel, the energy which you get when you are in the middle of a wave.
À côté de la muséographie,
Now, in addition to visiography, we've got programming. We want to have cultural programming, which will be open to the subjects which all public might be interested in, particularly the young. I mean, not just history, not so subjects to do with the challenges of the sea of today and tomorrow. So these are the subjects which are kind of topical subjects, which are concerned to the young generations. To attract them, we can say, well, yes, something's happening in the museum on new subjects, and which are topical subjects where they feel that they're concerned. As I said, ecology isn't just that, but ecology is a subject which brings the people along to the museum. It brings them into the museum. So there we can show them perhaps slightly different challenges and slightly different concepts to do with the sea. And this visiography, as I'm calling it, is open, and this can be done by exhibitions for the public at large. We're developing a public, which is called Sport. So digital games. So through this digital sport, we're able to get young people in, to get them to play using digital games about the sea. And so part of this can be, they can be brought in different themes, different subjects through games, online games, and there'll also be workshops and initiatives in which people can participate, and also involvement of societies, institutions, communities. I'm thinking about the influencers. I'm thinking about the ambassadors we created, the clubs of ambassadors for the maritime environment. That is, to get out and get in touch with the largest number of people possible, because a museum is 6 museums. We're in Brest here, but the Naval Museum is 6 museums, but so that a visitor doesn't know anything much about it says, oh yes, I have understood the importance of the ocean, and of course to protecting oceans. Just one last word, perhaps, I know. We're also thinking, because you're asking about how to get in touch with the younger generations, how to reach out to them, and how can we get into this new environment. The Minister of Polynesia was telling us about the way in which we kind of reach out to young people today. It's essential is to move into the virtual world. But we mustn't let this change of the world as to how can we reach out and how can we move from this virtual world to a natural world, because we know that among the thinkers and the metaverse, as we call it, that later on the real world and the virtual world will come together, will unite. I don't know if we got that far, but this is what we'd like to try to do. We'd like to try to get the young people away from their virtual world to see the origins and to see the real world. So this is a revolution, a very deep-ranging transformation and change, which we hope, and of course we'd love to invite you along at the end of next year to see whether in fact we've reached out to you. Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. And I think that we look forward to this inauguration of the museum into English now.
I had prepared for the last round was about communication. You as well as Robert, you spoke about communication, and I wanted to ask about the message in this communication. You said it's la mer est la future de l'humanité. And I would like to come back maybe to the point where we started to sum up a bit our discussions and ask about, again, about the responsibility, the social value of maritime museums, the responsibility of these museums for the maritime heritage, but as well for the society in which they are embedded, to which they show their heritage. If you could, maybe one of you or two, I don't know, Robert, if he's still connected, say in how far you try to raise awareness for this responsibility, to inspire it and assume it. Please.
Maybe I could just touch on something that's been on my mind recently, and I think goes to this idea of how we communicate and how we try to penetrate. Because I think the museum, okay, it's a house of memory. It's a place where you embed your values, where you know who you are by knowing your construct of the past. I mean, any psychologist or any human being can imagine, and any psychologist can tell you that if you didn't have a knowledge of what you just did, or you did the day before, or you did last year, or where you were born, what would you be? What would consciousness be? What would it mean to be a human being if you knew neither hope nor despair because you had no knowledge of what happened yesterday? And in a way, the museum as a house of memory is holding this for the public. And if we're holding this for the public, then we have to be careful about what we choose to hold. Because we know how difficult memory is. You only have to think of some of the people who need treatment for post-traumatic stress as a result of violent events to know that it's important how you embed a memory, how you understand it, so that you can share it in a way that supports good values, supports good decision-making, and binds people together, not splits them apart. And so we have a very, very important role to play. It's no longer the role of the super professor who is the holder and gatekeeper of all knowledge. It's no longer the attractions organizer of the commercial world of museums where it is enough to have fun. Somewhere we need to keep the expertise. We need to make sure people have fun, but we also need engagement that makes people understand themselves, understand how they got here, and what it means to be in that museum at that time looking at those things and why they should come. Now, I tiptoe around that a little bit because it is a hot topic in Britain. It is a very hot topic, and I can be censured by my government if I say the wrong things now. This is where we've come to. And yet Britain, in a maritime museum, I hold a collection which reflects a maritime empire which captured the records, the images, and the artifacts from disappearing tribes and emerging nations, and which is probably one of the best resources to understand what it means to be British in the 21st century. Because you can be black and British, you can be Chinese and British, you can be a Muslim and British. And if I don't engage in this way in understanding that we will change the meaning of being British, but we need to still retain values that will allow you to make fun of us for eating roast beef or for playing cricket. So how do we embed all these things in a way that gives people a chance to find themselves, to know their status and their importance? Because the history we told in 1930 when the museum was started was very clear. Of all the nations, the best were the British. To be born British was to win the lottery in life's great chances. That the British were better at sea than anybody else, and that the museum was to embed these values in the schoolboy public. And clearly that's not the museum we are today. We've been on a journey, we have a journey to continue, but we have to be ready to fight these challenges and fight for these values to understand really who we are.
Thank you for that. I think these were almost final words, and I'm told I may not pass the word to anybody else because we have to end the session. But I would like to, in the end, to quote again the speech of the minister this morning from Polynesia, because I think this expression you used, océaniser la conscience, it's very much this. Thank you very much for staying with us, although it's a long afternoon. there is still another session, so stay with them. And thank you for listening. Thank you.